I'm going to introduce TJ Fox. TJ is a native Texan and first became a Texas Master Naturalist with the Mid-Coast chapter. After moving to Pearland in 2012, he joined our Galveston Bay Area chapter. During TJ's 20 years as a Master Naturalist, he's accumulated over 5,000 volunteer service hours and has participated in many activities. He volunteered with the Sea Turtle Patrol, ranging from Padre Island to Galveston Island. TJ was a tour guide at Aransas National Wildlife Refuge and Welder Wildlife Foundation in Sinton, Texas. He's guided tours of NOAA's Galveston Turtle Barn and has worked with NOAA's Phytoplankton Monitoring Network. TJ participates with COCOROS and monthly water quality monitoring. The GBAC Advanced Training Team is lucky to have TJ as an active committee member. Today, TJ will tell us the story of early people of Texas. Please welcome TJ Fox.
Thank you. Before I get started, let me say kudos to Chuck again. He's going to actually be advancing the slides for me. I had a bandwidth problem. Chuck, if we can have the next one. I'm going to talk about early people of Texas. Next. I looked it up, generations 20 or so years, so we've had 750 generations of Texans here. They've had families, raised kids, taught their kids, provided for them, and moved on. All right, next one. Next slide, please. These people were obviously intelligent. They were certainly adaptable, and they were, you will find out, quite inventive. Next. They were originally in small groups, but who were they? Okay. Who were they? Where did they come from? And what were they like? Next. Well, they came over from Asia, crossed the land bridge between Asia and North America during the last ice age, and that was 13 to 20,000 years ago. Lots of alternative ideas about how they got here, but we're going to stick with that one. Next. What do we call them? Well, we call them Clovis people. And we'll find out a little bit later why we do that. The images of the man and the woman, those are actually reproductions from archaeological digs here in Texas and represent what those people really look like. Next. Well, what were they like? Well, we're going to briefly visit the Hadza. They're a group of probably half a dozen to maybe 10 tribes principally in Africa, who are hunters and gatherers. And they live in Western Central Africa. And we'll look at what they're like. Next. Next. First of all, they don't engage in any warfare. In fact, they don't even have a name for war in their language. They have no epidemics. Wouldn't that be nice? Next. They have no famine. In fact, members of their tribe or their group who have gone into farming and moved up will actually, in times of famine, come back and live as hunter-gatherers. Next. They have lots of leisure time. We're going to define leisure time as the amount of downtime you got after you provide, in whatever fashion, working, hunting, whatever, for your family's subsistence. Next. and they have almost no possessions. That's probably why they have so much leisure time. Next. They live in villages like this. Next. The groups are generally family, friends, in-laws, and fluctuate up and down. They have no official leader. Next. No adult has authority over any other adult. Next. They don't have wedding ceremonies. Next. But then when they're in a relationship, they don't necessarily fool around. Next. And finally, and maybe most importantly, everybody looks after the kids. Next. The men hunt and gather honey. The women gather fruits and berries and edible roots, whatever, and all the food is shared. Next. Next. They sleep on the ground with a light cover. Next. And they only make a shelter when there's potential for rains. Next. And about once a month or so, they moved. Now, this information came from a National Geographic author and photographer who spent about 4 months with the Hadza, and this is the results of their work. Next. In order to understand about early Texans, we're going to take a journey across Texas. And that journey is going to cover about 11,000 years. And it's going to take us over about 1,000 miles. Next. So let's start the journey way up in the central panhandle at a place called the Alabat's Flint Quarry, and it's a little over 11,000 years ago. Next. People came to this quarry to get the essentials that they needed for the tools that they lived under. Next. And here's some examples of the flint out of the quarry. It was so sought after that examples of this flint made into arrowheads and whatever have been found all over the United States. Next. And they used a fairly small toolkit, if you will, to make those stone tools. You see it up in the corner of your screen. And they became really experts at working the flint. Next. And the big thing that they created was this. This is a Clovis point. It is an outstanding piece of early engineering, and we'll talk more about that next. And they took this point and they attached it to a spear. Don't think of it as a javelin that you threw 50 or 60 foot. Think of it as a short throwing spear or a thrusting spear. Next. And start the video.
Have an extended toolkit.
But hunters did carry one item that was essential for survival: the Clovis point. This was a stone weapon that was one of the first technologies invented by humankind. It was discovered in 1932 next to a dead mammoth in Clovis, New Mexico. Later, scientists were able to carbon date the mammoth bones, estimating the age of the spearhead as 13,500 years old. The Clovis point was such an important hunting tool that anthropologists dubbed the prehistoric Native American culture who used it Clovis people. These hunters...
Next.
Have an extended toolkit.
Go back one, Chuck. with the Clovis point and their spears, they hunted these animals. This was the era of the megafauna. They had, North America had mammoths, they had mastodons. A large mammoth could be 10 to 13 foot high. The short-faced bear was 2,800 pounds. The bison that you see there was the ancestor of our current bison and was 8 foot tall at the shoulder. And of course, you see the giant sloth also. Next. Now we're going to move south, probably 300 miles or so, to a place around Lubbock called Yellow House Draw, and it's 20 or so years later. Next. This is what the draw looks like today. Next. This is what it may have looked like back 11,000 years ago. Good water, fuel, and good campsites. Next. Groups came here, did not stay permanently, built shelters as were appropriate, but the big reason they came here is next. Other groups came here and they gathered together, and their ultimate goal, well, was always, as always, to provide food for the family, and they were going to mammoth hunt. But this was also a good opportunity for young unmarried people to find a mate. As you can imagine, if you're in a group of a dozen or so people, all of whom are related, it's kind of hard to find somebody to get married to. So by meeting other groups like this, you would expand your opportunities. Next. And what they're going to do is they're going to hunt mammoth. Next. And you got two choices with your spear. Clovis tipped spear. You can, as that gentleman is doing, you can thrust it, or next, you can throw it like that. Next. Okay. Everybody ready? We're going to go on a mammoth hunt. You got your trusty spear with you? When you use that spear, the best thing that can happen, whether you throw it or you thrust it, is you kill the beast. Now, if you believe that, you've got about as much opportunity to do that as I do to win the lottery. Next. A good result is that you throw it or thrust it, you wound him, you pull the spear back out again, and you try again. Next. The worst result is you stick it in him and it gets stuck. Now what do? Well, you pull it, you try to pull it out, and you pull it out, and the disaster is when the shaft comes out, but you leave the spearhead in. Now you're facing a thoroughly pissed off mammoth with a pointed stick in your hand. So what do? You run. Or if you're one of those intelligent, inventive people, you invent the world's first muzzleloader. Next. You take your spear and you make it such that you have a short shaft with that Clovis point on it and that you can insert. Now, when you lose that original tip, you can reach down into your satchel, put on another one, and load your spear again, and you're ready to go. Next. Of course, when you are successful in a hunt, everything is used. The animal is skinned, the skin is used, the meat is used. You can see the guy there using the rocks to break the bones open so you can get the marrow out of them. The bones are used for tools as you can make out of them. Next. You probably eat for days off of it, gorge yourselves, dry in the sun what meat you think you can carry, and you move to the next side. Next. All right. I see lots of questions. Go ahead.
Well, I don't see any questions. So does anybody have any questions? Put them in the chat. If you do, there was a bunch of people that, congratulations to Jean Booth. She came the closest. So she guessed 75 people, and we actually had 76 at 5 after 2. So does anybody have any questions?
Well, let's move on then.
That's right. Okay.
We're now going to make a leap down to the Texas border. Just outside of what is now Big Bend National Park. And it's we're about 1700 years later. And we're going to visit a place called Bonfire Shelter. Next. Here, those inventive, intelligent people created the North America's first weapon of mass destruction. Next. And there it is. You're looking at a section of the Pecos River Canyon, and you'll notice that notch in the canyon. Next. Now we've moved across to the other side. Next. And there's that notch again. Next. And what we're going to do, we're after buffalo. Now, recognize that, go back one, recognize that herding buffalo is kind of like herding cats. It's very difficult to do. But if they're moving in the right area and you see that, next, you might create some strategic prairie fires to get them moving in the right direction. And you can really get them moving. Next. And as they approach the weapon, you could even have some people kind of strategically placed to keep them moving and driving. Next. Because your goal is this. Drive them off the cliff. This spot was used 4 times over several thousand years. The reason it was called a bonfire, one of the kills, and by the way, this is called a buffalo jump. One of the kills, they killed so many buffalo and they left so much in the way of skin and bones and whatever that the decomposing gases caught fire, and it created a big bonfire in the pile. And they know this because there's a layer of burned bones in that pile. Next. And of course, you take advantage of your kill, and everybody eats. Now, my wife and I full-time RV'd for about 4 years, and we were fortunate to visit a buffalo jump in southern Alberta, Canada. And this was a place called Head Smash Inn Buffalo Jump. And there was an interpretive museum. There were people to guide you and whatever. It was really a great tour. The reason it was called Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump was the fact that some teenage boys decided to go stand downstairs, if you will, to watch the buffalo come off. and they got their head smashed in. So it's called head smashed in buffalo jump. Next. But as we say, this was only used about 3 or 4 times over several thousands of years. Next. And you got to eat, so the kids have to learn how to hunt rabbit with sticks. Next. And you learn to catch fish, to harvest clams, mussels, whatever, to eat snails. Next. And of course, Mama goes to the grocery store. Next. Because you don't live by meat alone, so you take full advantage of the flora, excuse me. And here is a basket that was found in a cave in West Texas. I guess they had figured out a way not to use single-use plastic bags. And look at the clever design with the resting fork, the resting stick, so you can prop it up and fill it and then put it on your back and carry it. Next. Your home in this time was a shelter or cave along the canyon wall. Next. And you'll notice the arrow, and you'll notice the rock fall out of that one cave. That's not a rock fall. That is the detritus from thousands of years of early Texans who came and threw their garbage over the top. Now, interestingly enough, these are called rock shelters. I found out that a rock shelter means that the opening is wider than the shelter is deep. If the opposite happens and the opening is smaller than it is deep, then that's termed a cave. Next. And these were great places if they were situated correctly. You were protected from the weather, particularly in the wintertime, but they faced south. They could have dry floors. The one image that you see, and you see the flat rock with the holes in it, those are holes made by mortar and pestle, in effect, to grind whatever they could find to make meal and flour. Next. This is a shelter that's interesting. It's called the Kincaid Shelter. It's on a property that was owned by a family by the name of Kincaid. It's in the Sabinal River Valley. You see in the small picture a picture of, or a photograph of it in present day. And then you see a depiction of the shelter 10,000 years ago. Next. What's interesting about this shelter is that it has a constructed floor. That means that when they did an archaeological dig, they realized that, interestingly enough, the bottom was covered with rocks. Well, it could certainly be that way, except all of the rocks were placed with the flat side, if you will, up, and any rounded or bumpy side down. So it was probably a great place to live, except that it had a floor that would get wet and muddy in the rain. So they constructed this. Next. And this is the oldest known structural feature in North America. Next. And what I like to say is Texas' first home remodeling project are if your husband a honeydew. Next. They made lots of interesting things. You can see the sandals, the actual one that was found in a cave. There's a flute. There is a bead. There is a stone with carving on it. And anybody make a guess as to what this is? If you guessed comb, you're right. Next. We're going to move now to east, 300 or so miles to a place called the Bean Site. And we've now shed about 4,500 years, and it's about 4,500 years before present time. Next. A lot of things have happened in that 4,000 years. Next. First, all those big animals are gone. The ice age is over. Things have warmed up. The warm weather has killed them, or as some people think, the natives killed them off. Next. Groups have gotten much bigger. In fact, in many cases, they have started to identify themselves as tribes, if you will, which are separate from other tribes. With the larger groups, that means you had to have much different social interaction and social structure. That meant possibly leaders, certainly traditions, maybe medicine men or holy men of some kind. Next. And they had also quit meandering around and actually established a seasonal moving pattern, so that in the spring you were in this area because you knew that these resources were available. In the summer you moved to another, and etc. But next spring you were basically back in the same area again. Next. Because of this, you learn to really get down and know all of the plants in a particular area, and what was good and what was bad, what you could eat, what you could use for medicine, etc., as well as what hunting was available. Next. So you were much more adapted to your local environments. Next. And finally, because you weren't moving as much, you developed and were able to take with you many different kinds of specialized tool. Next. This particular site is on the Medina River. Next. And this is a depiction of what a village might have looked like. Next. You see the Hogan Wikia, whatever you'd like to call it, structure. And you can see that rather than just sticks and reeds put together, this one actually has animal skins, woven mats that cover it to make it maybe warmer in the wintertime and certainly more rain-free. Next. You'll notice that our early people have now acquired domesticated dogs. Next. And finally, you see this one guy. He seems to be constructing an arrow, but gosh, it's an awful long arrow. Next. Well, it's not an arrow, it's an atlatl dart. Next. Atlatl, think of it as a tennis racket to throw a spear. The device at the end that the guy's holding in his hand is actually a curved stick that he sets his shaft into, and then he like you would use a tennis racket, gains mechanical advantage by using that to throw the spear. From the depictions and the last picture you see, the spear actually, as it leaves the atlatl, it actually bends. And that means that it creates more energy. And as it flexes out, it can go further and faster. Next. And this is an interesting video. I don't hear any sound. It is much more impressive with the sound. With the atlatl, there he is. With the atlatl, you could throw this, you could project that thing at close to 90 miles an hour, and you could throw it, a football field in length, and you could be accurate with it, at 100 foot. So you're no longer up close and personal. Now you can step back while you hunt. Next. And with that, you're hunting the same thing that we hunt today if we were still hunting buffalo. Buffalo are of normal size, quote and unquote. You hunt deer, and as you can see, you have much more flexibility with the atlatl. Next. But you still gotta rely on things like snares. Next. And the kids still gotta go out and hunt rabbits. Next. But you have a lot more edible plants that you use. You make mesquite flour, you harvest wild onions, you know that you can use cattail in many different ways. And in all of these things, that adds to not only how the food tastes, but also to the nourishment of that food. Next. And because you're going to be in a place a while, you can afford to make some fairly permanent ways to cook. And as you can see, they were very ingenious about how they were able to do this. The lower right-hand corner, I have actually, as an old Boy Scout, experimented with this, and it's really quite effective. We put a tanned hide down in the hole. You put your food down in there. Then you build a fire and you put rocks into the fire and heat them up and put the hot rocks down into the water and make a stew out of it, and it works really quite well. Next. Now we're going to move all the way down to the Texas coast. And we've jumped, 3,000 or 4,000 years, and it's about 500 BP, and that's before present. Next. And now the big thing that's taken place is the early Texans are no longer alone. It's 1492, and big changes are in the wind. Next. Here's a map of Texas of 1500 with the principal tribes that they can identify and their locations. You notice that the Caddo are over in East Texas. Tonkawas occupy the middle of the state. The Hermanos are down on the Mexican-Texas border. in West Texas, and they are semi Pueblo Indians. Interestingly enough, the Apaches inhabit the Panhandle, but 150 years before that, there were no Apaches. The Apaches actually came from almost up on the Canadian border and were driven down into Texas by the Comanche. And you will notice that there are no Comanche shown in Texas. This is 1500, and the Comanche had not yet acquired horses, and therefore they were not the lords of the plains that they ultimately became, because as they got them, they drove the Apaches west into New Mexico and Arizona. Next. Talk about tribal names for a while. First of all, many of the tribes and tribal names that we know today were actually documented by Europeans. And the way they did that, they would either ask, as they visited somebody, what do you call yourselves? Well, most people just said, we're the people. Or if you were really full of yourself, we're the chosen people, or maybe the civilized people. But in many cases, you were visiting a tribe and you said, what's the next group called? Well, in the case of the Tonkawa, that's really a Waco tribal word meaning they keep together. And Cheyenne is really a Sioux name, meaning the relatives of the Crow. And as you see, Apache was a Zuni word that simply meant enemy. Next. I am told that we need to take a short intermission now, and if you got some questions.
Yeah, let's go. TJ, that's pretty good. We've got a couple of questions. You might have answered Patty's. Patty Pennington, why don't you unmute, and maybe you've got a follow-up question.
Yes, TJ, hi, how are you?
Just fine.
My question has to do with the domestication of dogs. In the early part where you had the mammoth hunt, one of those pictures, it looked to me, was showing domestic dogs following them. So I'm just curious, did they come across the Bering Strait, or just how did that happen?
I do not know the answer to that. It's my impression that dogs were not, that we did not get, early Texans did not have domesticated dogs until, less than 10,000 years ago. But I will look that up and try to get some information back to you.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
And Mohammed, why don't you unmute and ask your question?
Hey, TJ, do you know what language did the Hadza in Texas speak?
Well, the Hadza were not in Texas. They're alive today and live in Africa. But the reason I talked about them is they are hunter-gatherers. And by looking at them, we can get information or make conjectures about the way early Texas people lived when they were hunters and gatherers.
Okay.
Do I make myself clear?
Yeah, so the ones, the tribes here in Texas, did each of these tribes have their own languages, or?
I don't believe that there were distinct languages. I think that was, I would surmise that is an outgrowth of the creation of individual tribes as they got to be, a group got to be more cohesive, as they viewed themselves more as individuals and as, if you will, different from other groups. Then they probably started developing their own language. But it's another good question and another area that I am really not that familiar with.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And one last question for this break from Mitch. Why don't you unmute? I'm going to come up with unmask every time. Sorry. Mitch, you there?
Yeah. Okay, there I am. Yeah, I've been reading. Let's see if I can hold this up there. This is a book about the very, very early people in Texas, the Anglos that came, and the cattle people. And they said that when they got here, these are two tribes, Ashka and Atahapa tribes, were already here with cattle. Not only did they take to the horses, they took to the cattle too. And they were already raising and herding cattle when we got here. So I just didn't know if you know anything more about them.
The information I have is that cattle, that there were no native cattle in North America, just like there were no horses left in North America. The horse that there had actually been early horses in North America, but they had gone extinct long before people made that crossing of the land bridge. Right. And to my knowledge, there were no. That was one of the problems with North America, in that they had no easily usable beast of burden, and they had no horses for transportation. And of course, they had not invented the wheel as well. But I would find it interesting if maybe the local Indians had acquired cattle from down in Mexico that had strayed across, but of course people had been in Mexico for a number of years before they came up to Texas.
Well, these are the ones left over by the Spaniards after they left Florida back in the 1500s. Yeah.
I would not find that unbelievable that there were groups that had managed to corral and teach themselves how to be cowboys. Yeah, I have not read that, but I don't find it surprising.
Very good. All right then. Thank you, guys, and we'll get in this last section. We'll have questions at the end.
And finally, we're going to talk about the Karakola people. Next. There were 5 major groups of Karakolas, the Cocos being the northernmost, and they actually probably ranged and occasionally went to Galveston Island, certainly came up into Brazoria County. And then there were 4 other groups ranging down the Texas coast, all the way down to just north of Corpus Christi. In fact, the Copains, for years I lived on Copano Bay, which derives its word from that group of Karakolas. Next. We have lots of problems with the Karakolas. The first one is we seem to have a real problem on how to spell Karakola. I have seen all of these used. The bottom one is the one that is generally used, except there is a Karakola Bay about midway between here and Rockport that has the C-A-R-A-N spelling. So, but Karakola, K-A-R-A-N, K-A-W-A, is more or less what is used. Next. We also have a problem with what did they look like? Many people said they were tattooed. They ran around with either completely nude or with just a loincloth on. Had all kinds of ear piercings, whatever. Or, next. This is the inside cover of a Texas Parks and Wildlife magazine. And here you can see a much more, what I prefer to think of as romanticized image of a Karakola. Almost the noble red man, you know, looking off into the distance. So, next. As I say, I grew up in Corpus Christi. I was active in the Boy Scouts. I worked at Camp Karakola, which was the local Boy Scout camp. I was a member of the Karakola Lodge. And so there were lots of things that I learned in my growing up that were truths about the Karakolas. Next. The first one is they were all 7 foot tall. In fact, I had a scoutmaster one time who had what he said was a finger bone from the little finger of a Karakola Indian, and it was as long as my whole little finger. So, next. They were cannibals. Everybody said they were cannibals. I mean, you know, the Spaniards said they were cannibals. The early Texans said they were cannibals. Next. One thing that seemed to be universally true is that they were lazy, no good, you know, had no culture, did not have many redeeming virtues. Next. And finally, by 1850, they were gone as a tribe and a people. Next. So, what's true? Next. Well, in putting this presentation together and learning as much as I could, I stumbled on a tremendous website called Texas Beyond History. And as you can see, it's a service of the University of Texas and other universities, and it is tremendous and very authentic information about early Texans. Next. I also spent a lot of time with this book, which is written by Robert Reckless, who got his doctorate at Texas A&M Corpus Christi, and this is actually an expansion of his doctoral thesis about the Karakola Indians. Next. And finally, I was fortunate enough to get a copy of this book, The Karakola Indians, Coast People of Texas, written by a guy by the name of Gatchett in 1891. Now, the book itself, to put it bluntly, it has all of the cliches that were apparent, that were put around about the Karakola Indians. Gatchett was a history and professor and whatever at Yale University, but it does have a very interesting section where he was able to visit with a woman by the name of Alice Williams. Mrs. Williams' family and she had grown up on Matagorda Island, where the family ranched, and there were 3 or 4 Karakola Indians who still lived there, who became workers on their ranch, and Mrs. Williams learned the Karakola language. And in this book, there are about 300 different Karakola words. So that was its value. Next. The Karakolas had many, many campsites, and these are, as you can see, around Corpus Christi and then north of there, but there were a heavy concentration. Next. Karakolas were seasonal movers. In the wintertime, in the fall and winter, they had shoreline camps, and these camps could be anywhere from 200 to 500 people. As it became warmer and warmer into the spring and the summer, those groups broke up and they moved inland along the rivers, where they completely changed what they were trying to find for food. Next. This is a winter camp along a bay in Texas somewhere. The word you see at the bottom is the Karakola word for camp, or as close as you could get to that. And you could see it's a fairly permanent settlement in that the shelters are fairly enclosed because it's going to be winter. They're making nets. They do have dogs. In fact, they had a great number of dogs, and many times they were called the dog people. Next. They used the nets for fishing. Net. And they caught the same thing that if you're a fisherman these days, you would catch: redfish, spotted sea trout, drum, and that AM, however you pronounce that, is the Karakola word for fish. Next. Otoliths. Otoliths are tiny, tiny bones that you can see here that function in fish to help them know which ends up. They're basically a part of the inner structure of their skulls, and they are used so that a fish knows which ends up. We have otoliths. They don't look like this, but we have otoliths in our inner ear that help us maintain our balance. Next. If you find that otolith, you can tell from its shape what kind of fish it came from. And if you put it under a microscope, you can also see that it has rings just like a tree does. And as you would readily surmise, a growth ring that is wide means that happened during this warm weather, because fish, being cold-natured, do not grow in cold water. So if it's a narrow ring, that means it was during the fall or the winter. If it's a wide ring, that means it's spring or summer. And the last ring lets you know with some degree of certainty as to whether it was harvested in the fall or in the midsummer. Next. And these were found throughout Dr. Rickless's archaeological digs, and with these, he could determine what the principal diet of the Karakolas were in that spot, how much protein they got, and surprisingly enough, they got a lot of protein because they ate during the winter And during the fall and winter, they ate a lot of fish, got a lot of protein. Next. Not only from fish, but also from oysters, all kinds of mussels, scallops, whatever. Next. They also ate turtles, sea turtles. Next. And in the spring, they began moving inland along the coast. They probably never got more than, maybe 30 miles inland, but they came on to the mainland. And next, they set up camps. And here they changed their hunting completely to accommodate what was available. Next. And they hunted buffalo. Yes, buffalo came all the way down to the Texas coast. They hunted deer, they hunted javelina, they hunted alligator. In fact, they used the alligator, supposedly used a grease from the alligator to smear on themselves to counteract one of their nemesis. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Next. They hunted rabbits. Next. And they gathered all kinds of local flora that they could eat. Pecans were great. They were abundant. They were easily harvested. They were easily carried and stored in their shells, and they were high in protein. So they were a great food. And in fact, there are stories that tribal groups that would normally have never intermingled would intermingle in the pecan groves along the Texas coast. Next. They did have bow and arrow. Next. And they did make pottery. Their most famous pottery is what's called the Rockport phase. It was incised pottery, meaning that it had patterns around the outside. Next. It's not very good pottery because they probably didn't have access to good quality clay. And of course, they didn't have any way to fire it. But they did, using everything they could, when they were on the beach, they would gather tar balls. Now, those are naturally occurring pieces of asphaltum that wash up on the Texas coast. And if you melt them down and get them soft, you can smear them on the inside of the pottery to make it waterproof. That particular picture is of a pot that is in a museum in Bay City, Texas, and it represents the most complete piece of Karakola pottery that we found so far. Next. Their shelters were appropriate to the time of year. In the winter, hides across the top, whatever to make them as warm as possible. But as you moved into the summer, only a shade shelter. Next. They did make canoes that they used to transport across, particularly from the islands to the mainland, up rivers, that kind of thing. Next. Everybody's got to have booze. They did manage to make a drink that they called the black drink. They made it from Yopon holly, which, interestingly enough, part of the scientific name of a Yaupon holly is vomitorium, in that the leaves will make you vomit, but they managed to figure out a way to ferment them and next, and of course, have a good old time. But like in many cultures, it seemed to be the men who took advantage of the booze while the women did all the work. Next. So, in the final analysis, what do we know about the Karakola? Next. Were they cannibals? Next. Well, again, Dr. Rickless, in all of his workings, never found any, and did find human bones, but never found on those bones any evidence of cannibalism. Now, there is a book that was written in the 1930s by a well-respected historian and author called The Cannibal Coast, who talks about the cannibalism of the Karakola with actually not a shed of proof. Next. Cabeza de Vaca, who you may know wandered the Texas coast after being, he and some of his cohorts were stranded on Matagorda Island. De Vaca managed to get over to the mainland. When they came back to rescue other members of his party, the Karakolas were horrified that the survivors had cannibalized their fellow crewmen as they had died in order to survive. So, were they cannibals? No. Next. Were they 7 foot tall? Next. Well, nah, they're probably 6 foot tall. But then you have to remember that the average European then was only about 5 foot tall. So somebody a foot taller than you always looks tall. Next. Were they lazy? Next. They took full advantage of all of the resources that they had available and lived a continuing and productive life for several thousand years. They ate well. They overcame problems. That alligator grease that I was talking about was a problem that we share with them, and that's mosquitoes. They rub the alligator grease on them, supposedly, to keep the mosquitoes away. Plus, they also built fires at night that were smoky to keep the mosquito down. We know that because Cabeza de Vaca, again, in his book, indicates that many nights they would have to stay up all night long, he and the 3 fellows who survived with him, to keep the fires going, to keep the smoke, and therefore the mosquitoes down. Next. And gone by 1850. Next. Well, you can see, I hope you can see this small print. The population, Rickless extrapolates that probably in the late 1600s, there were many as 8,000 or 9,000 Karakolas. And over this period of time of less than 200 years, the last estimate is 80. Now, eventually they were driven out of Texas entirely into Mexico. And they came back from Mexico, a small group, and they were attacked in the valley in 1858. And if there were any survivors, they moved back into Mexico, but as a tribe, the Karakolas were gone. Next. So by 1858. And those two words mean, in the Karakola language, gone or vanished and dead. Next. In conclusion, I will tell you an interesting comment. I stumbled onto this Texas Beyond History website. I mean, they have such good information. It's such authoritative. It's well maintained, well researched. And as I was finishing up, I thought, gosh, I wonder if I'm in trouble. Well, I found a place on the website where I could contact them, and I sent them an email in great trepidation saying, you know, this is what I've done, and I hope you will give me your permission to use it. Within a short period of time, as I recall, less than 2 or 3 hours, I get an email in response, and the opening words of that email were, "You have made our day." This is exactly why we created this website. In fact, the woman who responded to me said, "Well, my husband is a master naturalist." So I have thanked them time and time again, and I would encourage you, if you're at all interested, to just Google Texas Beyond History and enjoy their information. Next. And that's all the ramblings that I have.